Hello again, everybody. So for this video, I'm going to look at President Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression in 1929 and how his actions both made the Depression in many ways worse, but also look at how his failure to adjust his ideology in the face of the mass suffering that the Depression produced would ultimately um, lead to a growing militancy amongst the American working class that threatened law and order and civil society in the United States by 1932. So let's start off with what President Hoover tries to do to correct um, the depression, and then look at what he doesn't do. So as I mentioned in the previous video, when the Depression hits the U.S. in October of 1929, many people at the time were relieved that Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. They thought, well, this is a guy who's, smart, he's got a good head on his shoulders, he's done all these other great things in the past. He's going to be able to fix this problem. Um, there's a couple of problems with that. The first is that Hoover, although he was a well respected public figure in the United States prior to becoming president of the United States, was politically very inexperienced and lacked a lot of political intuition and sense. He'd never held an elected office before becoming president of the United States. He'd held a number of appointed positions in the U.S. government, like Secretary of Commerce, but he'd never been elected president. He'd never been elected to anything. And so that lack of elected experience ultimately gives him a certain tone deafness in terms of how he responds to the Depression that really rubs a lot of people the wrong way, to put it mildly. Now, the other thing that proves to be a major inhibitor for Hoover is his own ideology. Although Hoover, his response to the Depression is hardly he didn't cause a depression, and he definitely doesn't sit back and just do nothing, as is sometimes the perception. The fact of the matter is that his ideology both limited the types of responses that he was willing to entertain, as well as contributed to the pursuit of policies that actually made the Depression in many ways quite even worse. Um, as a result of all these things, by 1933, by the time Hoover leaves office, um, unemployment in the United States is over 25%, and social unrest is prevalent throughout the country. So, what does Hoover try to do to address the Depression? Well, he does actually a couple of things. The first thing that he tries to do is he tries to get business leaders to sign this voluntary compact in which they pledge not to lay off workers or slash production, to basically just keep things going, as if the stock market hadn't crashed, and as if the economy wasn't entering free fall. This doesn't last, however, though. Within a matter of months, as demand falls for many consumer goods, many factories do begin doing just what Hoover wanted them not to do, laying off workers, and this kind of creates this vicious cycle. Um, as demand decreases, factories lay off workers, which in turn takes money out of the economy that can be spent to buy goods. This leads to other workers in turn losing their jobs, and on and on and on. Again, just sort of creating this vicious downward spiral economically, as more and more industries slash jobs, and as more and more people find themselves out of work. And it just keeps repeating itself ad nauseum. And so Hoover tries to respond to this by doing a couple of things to try to, kind of kickstart the domestic economy. And one of the things that he does is he raises tariffs on imported goods coming into the United States. Mind you, tariffs had already been raised several times during the 1920s by both President Harding and President Coolidge. But Hoover decides to raise tariffs on imported goods to protect American manufacturers even more. This ends up backfiring, of course, as many countries that are the subject of these tariffs respond by raising their own, denying many American industries, particularly the agricultural industry, which is entirely dependent at this point largely on overseas trade, from access to the markets they need. And so that actually further fuels the depression. The tariffs that Hoover promotes actually, they backfire because, again, the thing about a trade war is that, both sides can fire shots. And definitely, countries respond to our fire by returning their own. So that's one thing he does. Another thing that he tries to do really rubs Americans the wrong way. And that is that he sets up something in 1932 called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And the idea behind this is that you would pump money into banks and various industries to promote economic activity with the idea that it would eventually trickle its way down to workers in the forms of hiring and new jobs. And so this belief in what is commonly referred to as trickle-down economics, it didn't work. Point of fact, never has worked in the many times it's been tried in the United States. One critic actually captured the basic essence of this, calling this feeding the sparrows by feeding the horses, which, if you follow the analogy, is, it's pretty gross, but, you get the idea. But anyway, so that proves to be very unpopular. He does increase spending on public works programs, including the hydroelectric dam on the Colorado River that would eventually bear his name, that powers modern-day Las Vegas and much of the American Southwest. But he isn't able to expend public works enough to compensate for the growing job losses that are produced by the Depression. Which really brings us to his principal failing as a president in dealing with the magnitude of the suffering produced by the Great Depression, which is his unwillingness to yield in the face of object reality or to modify his ideology to accommodate a new reality that many Americans were living. Basically, Hoover believes that it's perfectly acceptable for the government to prop up markets and to, promote public works and all that stuff, but he's dead set against the idea of providing any kind of direct relief to people who, again, through no fault of their own, find themselves jobless and in many instances homeless as a result of these things. He believes, one, it's the responsibility of public charities, or private charities rather, and state and local governments to provide these sorts of reliefs to people. And then on top of that, there's the fact that Hoover basically believes that providing direct relief to people in the form of, money or other sorts of handouts would kill the individualistic spirit of the American people and create a culture of dependency that he saw as, kind of the start of the road down to socialism and communism. So, Hoover fundamentally repeatedly rejects calls for public relief for millions of Americans who, again, through no fault of their own, find themselves out of work and unable to provide for themselves and their families. And so the task of providing for these people is left up to state and local governments and charities. And there's just not enough to go around. Millions of people face starvation. Millions more find themselves homeless, encamped in shanty towns that pop up in cities throughout the country. And many people increasingly blame this on President Hoover. They blame their problem. They lay the the blame for their problems directly at the feet of Hoover. And this is reflected in the fact that people begin referring to these shantytown encampments as Hoovervilles. And people begin referring to an empty pocket as a Hoover wallet. They refer to a newspaper used on a park bench as a blanket, as a Hoover blanket. So there's this deep, visceral anger directed at Hoover because of what many see as his callous indifference to the vast human suffering produced by the Great Depression. Now, again, Hoover personally might empathize with people, but he does not communicate this effectively. And he, is absolutely unwilling to, modify his ideology in any way to reflect the new reality of a country where upwards of a quarter of the people are out of work, and where mass starvation and mass homelessness are major, major issues. And so, as a result of this, unsurprisingly, many people become increasingly militant in their attitudes. In rural America, many farmers whose neighbors get foreclosed on by banks when they're unable to satisfy their mortgage debts because of the drying up of the international agricultural market, they stage what are known as penny sales, where the neighbors of the person whose home was foreclosed on would basically go up on the day of the auction. They'd show up with, racked shotguns, and basically the message was, it wasn't necessarily stated overtly, but it was pretty clear, don't bid on this property, and we're backing this up by being armed. And so what oftentimes would happen with those penny sales is then, of course, the property would sell at a very low price and either would be bought directly by the person who had been foreclosed on, or would be bought by their friends who would then in turn give it back to them. So you see this kind of militant activity like this. In addition, the period of the early Great Depression sees a marked increase in crime of all sorts. This is oftentimes referred to as the golden age of crime in America, the public enemy era in American crime. And a big part of that is because you get these bank robbers operating primarily in the Midwest and the rural South, in Missouri, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Illinois, and other areas of the South, like Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde, who many people come to see incorrectly, but many people do come to see them as modern day, Robin Hoods. They see these bank robbers, many of whom are cold-blooded murderers, not as, what they in fact are, but as people who are striking back against an unfair system. They see them as people who are going in, who are, robbing the very people that had caused them their misery in many instances, or caused them to lose their homes. And so the authorities oftentimes have a very difficult time tracking these people down, and many of them are able to, for rather extended periods of time, hide in broad daylight, knowing full well that people won't tell the authorities where they are. So it becomes a major problem. They write songs about these people, like the Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd, where Woody Guthrie, who also wrote the anthem "This Land Is Your Land" in 1933, throughout this land you wander, throughout this land you roam. Some men will rob you with a 6-gun, others will rob you with a fountain pen, but throughout this land you wander, throughout this land you roam. You'll never see a robber drive their family from their home. So, that's another manifestation of this growing militancy, this support for these, bank robbers these public enemies that many come to see as these sort of latter-day Robin Hood figures. There's also increasingly growing strike activity in the United States, strikes that in many cases turn violent. And there is an upsurge in membership in radical organizations like the Communist Party. which sees its membership spiked over 100,000 in the early 1930s because of the systematic and monumental failure of capitalism that the Great Depression represents, and the desperation that it produces in many people. And so those are things that are, in part, at least at the foot of Hoover, for failing to address the social needs, and the suffering that many people are feeling as a result of the Great Depression. As a result of all these things, his popularity, of course, sinks precipitously. And it was already by 1932, he's in political trouble. Um, but the final nail in his coffin comes that year when a group of World War I veterans, who call themselves the Bonus Marchers or the Bonus Army — I've seen both terms used — assemble in Washington demanding the payment of a pension that had been promised to them in 1924. Basically, in 1924, the government had agreed to pay every person who had served in uniform during the First World War a pension, which amounted to $1 for every day they spent in uniform, plus some extra for those who had been deployed overseas. Given the relatively brief duration of American involvement in the First World War, for many, this wasn't a huge sum of money. On average, it was around $500 for most people. Not enough to completely eradicate the suffering that the Depression caused or put people completely back on their feet. But at a time when people are incredibly desperate, when millions of people are homeless, and have lost their jobs and have to dig through the trash, um, you know, or steal food to feed their families, or if they're in the rural countryside, kill varmints, to feed their families. Um, Anything will help. And so this group assembles in Washington, and they petition Congress for the early payment of this bonus, which wasn't supposed to be paid until 1945. At which point, many of the veterans figured, well, I might be dead by this point. So, and I need this now. My family needs this now. And so you get this group of 10,000 veterans assembling in Washington, D.C. And it's a remarkably um, integrated um, gathering at a time when the U.S. Army was still intensely segregated. The encampment of the Bonus Army workers featured both white and black World War I veterans encamped side by side with one another, marching together, advocating for the same thing. So in a period of intense segregation, this was a rare instance of integration in the face of dire need. And so what ends up happening is Congress rejects their demands for early payment of the bonus. The democratically controlled House votes to give it to them. The Republican-controlled Senate rejects it. And so President Hoover is then tasked with dealing with these 10,000 World War I veterans who had encamped in the nation's capital. And he decides to, fearing that their presence there would produce riots, he sends in the army, specifically General Douglas MacArthur, who would later command American troops in the Pacific and later in Korea. MacArthur exceeds the orders of what Hoover had given him and sends in army troops with bayonets fixed. He sends troops in tanks, and he orders tear gas canisters fired into the ramshackle dwellings, the shanties that these makeshift dwellings that these World War I veterans had assembled. And so as a result, because of the incendiaries from tear gas canisters, pretty much everything goes up in smoke. It all burns to the ground. And so the image of American soldiers being sent in at gunpoint, evict these men who in many cases had fought in a previous war on the battlefields of the Western Front, is a rather galling image. And it's an image that sears itself into the minds of many Americans ahead of the 1932 election, effectively dooming President Herbert Hoover in that year's contest. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. Guys, have a good one.